Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was the chosen champion of Odin and Asgard. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The wind that whipped across the rooftop felt cruel. It was a mundane, everyday wind, the kind that rustled leaves and kicked up dust in the streets below, but to Izuku Midoriya, it felt like a personal affront. It tugged at the straps of his yellow backpack, chilled the tear tracks on his cheeks that he hadn't even realized were there, and seemed to mock the hollow space that had just been carved out of his chest. The space had once been filled with a dream. It was a brilliant, sun-bright, glorious dream that had defined every moment of his 14 years. Now, it was a gaping wound, and the words that had inflicted it echoed in the cold air. Without a quirk, it's not possible. The words had come from All Might. Not the towering, barrel-chested symbol of peace with a smile that could calm a hurricane, but a skeletal, sunken-eyed man wreathed in steam. The truth. The ugly, painful, unvarnished truth. It was one thing to hear it from doctors, from his classmates, from Kaken's explosive taunts. It was another thing entirely to have it delivered as a death sentence by God himself. I see. Izuku had mumbled, his voice a choked whisper. His meticulously detailed notebook, Hero Analysis for the Future, number 13, felt like a block of lead in his hand. A child's fantasy, a tome of useless nonsense. All Might had softened, his voice thick with a weary sort of pity that was somehow worse than scorn. It's not bad to dream, young man. But you have to be realistic. He had pointed towards the door to the stairwell. Pro-heroes are always risking their lives. Some villains just can't be beaten without powers. So no, I honestly can't say that you can be a hero without a quirk. Each word had been a hammer blow, shattering the stained glass image of his future he had so carefully constructed. He had stood there, a statue of disbelief, as All Might offered a more practical alternative. A police officer. A firefighter. Good, noble professions. But they weren't it. They weren't the dream. He'd watched the number one hero depart, leaving him alone with the city sprawling beneath him, a vibrant tapestry of lives he was now officially unqualified to save. The journey down the building's stairwell was a blur of echoing footsteps and a profound, bone-deep numbness. The world outside the grimy windows was muted, the colors leached away. The cheerful shouts of children, the rumble of traffic, the distant wail of a siren, it was all just noise, the soundtrack to a world he was no longer a part of. He was an audience member, a spectator, a civilian. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. He walked without direction, his feet scuffing against the pavement. His mind was a maelstrom of failure. Useless. Quirkless. Deku. Kaken's voice was there, of course, a constant companion throughout his life. But now it was harmonized with the weary, regretful tone of his idol. The chorus was unbearable. He should just go home. He should go home, put his stupid notebook in a box, and try to figure out what a person like him was supposed to do with the rest of his empty life. But his feet carried him towards the sound of commotion, a familiar pull he couldn't resist, an instinct honed by years of chasing hero fights, of craning his neck to catch a glimpse of a costume or a new ultimate move. A pathetic, ingrained habit. He rounded a corner and saw it. A crowd, a fire, and the telltale signs of a villain attack. Smoke billowed from the narrow shopping district, thick and acrid. Pro-heroes were on the scene. Death Arms was evacuating civilians, his muscular arms like steel girders. The new heroine, Empty Lady, was struggling with the confined space. Kamui Woods was busy rescuing people from the flames. And in the center of it all, a vortex of viscous green sludge, was the villain. The same one All Might had saved him from not an hour before. The bottle must have fallen from his pocket during that terrifying mid-air cling. This is my fault. The thought hit him with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. If he hadn't grabbed onto All Might, if he hadn't been so selfish, so desperate, then he saw who the villain had captured. Spiky blonde hair. A furious, terrified snarl. Explosions erupting erratically, uselessly, from the sludge that was suffocating him. Kaken. Izuku's blood ran cold. Bakugo Katsuki, Kaken, who was always so strong, so confident, so overwhelmingly powerful, was drowning. He was thrashing, fighting, but being slowly, horribly consumed. And the heroes, they weren't doing anything. I can't get a solid grip on him. Death Arms yelled. He's too fluid. My gigantification won't work in this alley. Empty Lady lamented. I do more harm than good. They were waiting. Waiting for someone with the right quirk. Waiting for someone better suited for the job. And all the while, Kakin was dying. Izuku saw his eyes. Through the swirling green filth, he saw Bakugo's eyes, wide with a terror Izuku had never seen in them before. It was a desperate, pleading look. A look that screamed for a hero. And no one was moving. Izuku didn't decide to run. He didn't weigh the pros and cons. He didn't think about his quirklessness, about All Might's words, about the absolute certainty of his own death if he stepped forward. His body simply bypassed his brain. 1 second he was a part of the horrified crowd, and the next, his scuffed red sneakers were pounding against the pavement, carrying him towards the monster. Far away, in a place that was not a place, on a throne that was more than a throne, an old king watched. The throne was Hliskjolf, carved from the heartwood of a long-dead world, and it sat in the highest chamber of Asgard's royal palace. From it, Odin Allfather could gaze upon all the 9 realms, observing the intricate, cosmic dance of life and death that played out across the branches of Yggdrasil, the world tree. He saw the glittering, crystalline spires of Alfheim, heard the silent, ancient songs of the light elves. He felt the smoldering heat from the heart of Muspelheim, where the fire demons forged weapons of cosmic destruction. He witnessed the quiet dignity of the dwarves in their subterranean kingdom of Nidavellir, their hammers ringing like a billion chiming stars. But today, the Allfather's gaze was heavy, burdened by a weariness that transcended millennia. Power. It was the currency of the realms, the language of kings and gods. And he was its master. The Odin force, a power nearly without limit, flowed through him, a raging river that had carved the destiny of the 9 realms. Yet, he had seen what unchecked power did to the soul. He saw it in the simmering resentment of his younger son, Loki, a mind as sharp and as treacherous as a shard of glass. He saw it, more worryingly, in the burgeoning arrogance of his elder son Thor. Thor was a magnificent warrior, brave and mighty, his heart as vast as the Asgardian plains. But his bravery was often indistinguishable from recklessness. His confidence was a razor's edge away from hubris. He wielded Mjolnir with unmatched skill, but he believed the hammer was the source of his worth, not a mere conduit for it. Odin feared that one day, Thor's love of battle would overshadow his duty to protect peace. He was a good prince, but he was not yet a wise king. A king's strength was not in the force of his blow, but in the weight of his sacrifice. This was a lesson Thor had yet to learn, and so, Odin watched. He searched. He had grown tired of champions defined by their might, of heroes born with destiny laid at their feet. Such power often curdled the spirit, breeding entitlement and pride. He sought something different, something pure. He sought a strength not of the fist, but of the heart. A spirit forged not in victory, but in adversity. A soul who understood the true meaning of heroism because they had known true powerlessness. His gaze, a shimmering thread of golden light invisible to all mortal and most immortal eyes, drifted across the cosmos. It swept past the frozen wastes of Jotunheim and the lush, untamed wilds of Vanaheim. It settled, as it often did, on the chaotic, vibrant realm of Midgard, Earth. A world of fragile, short-lived creatures who possessed the capacity for both breathtaking cruelty and astonishing, selfless love. They were a paradox, a cacophony of ambition and fear, yet every so often, one of them would shine. A single soul would burn with a light that could rival the heart of a star. Odin's vision pierced the veil of Midgard's atmosphere, focusing on a small island nation teeming with a new kind of power. Quirks, they called them. An evolution that had granted them abilities once reserved for gods and sorcerers. He watched their costumed pro-heroes, beings of immense power, yet so many of them motivated by fame, by fortune, by the roar of the crowd. Their heroism was a performance. It was not without merit, but it was tainted. His focus narrowed, drawn to a disturbance, a spike of fear and violence in a city called Muzidifu. He saw the sludge creature, a mindless thing of malice and desperation. He saw the captured boy, a vessel of explosive power, ironically trapped by his own quirk. He saw the other heroes, powerful and capable, yet paralyzed by circumstance and procedure. And then, he saw him, a small, green-haired boy standing at the edge of the crowd. Odin's gaze went deeper than the physical. He saw not flesh and bone, but the tapestry of the soul. This boy's spirit was frayed, ripped and torn by a lifetime of scorn and disappointment. A gaping, fresh wound throbbed at its center, a dream brutally murdered. He was the epitome of powerlessness, a single, flickering candle in a storm. Then the boy moved. He ran. Odin leaned forward on Hliskjolf, his single eye widening. The boy ran towards the monster. He ran towards certain death. He had no power. No weapon. No strategy that could possibly succeed. The other heroes shouted. The crowd gasped. The sludge villain laughed, its gurgling voice a promise of a swift, painful end. But Odin saw what they did not. He saw the why. The boy wasn't running to win. He wasn't running for glory or recognition. In that moment, he wasn't even thinking. He was moving on an impulse so pure, so deeply ingrained in the fiber of his being that it superseded all logic and all fear. He saw another in peril, and his soul knew only one response: save them. It was the single most heroic act Odin had witnessed in 5,000 years. It was not Thor charging a legion of frost giants with Mjolnir held high. It was not the Einherjar marching into glorious battle at Valhalla. This was a courage born of absolute despair. It was the desperate, beautiful defiance of a single mortal soul against the universe that had told him he was nothing. A boy with no power, offering his own life simply for the chance to save another. A slow, ancient smile touched the Allfather's lips. It was a smile of profound revelation. There, he thought, his voice a whisper that resonated through the golden halls of Asgard. There you are. He had found his champion. Izuku's lungs burned. The world had narrowed to a tunnel of smoke, fire, and the gurgling mass of green sludge. The shouts of the pro-heroes were a distant buzz, like flies trapped in a jar. You idiot! Stop! Get back here, kid! You'll get yourself killed! His mind, finally catching up to his legs, screamed at him. What are you doing? What can you possibly do? You're quirkless. But another part of him, the part that had filled 13 notebooks with hero analysis, took over. It was a desperate, frantic scramble for a solution, any solution. Weaknesses? What are its weaknesses? The eyes. He has eyes. If I can just distract him. For a second, his yellow backpack felt heavy, a clumsy weight slowing him down. An idea sparked. It was stupid. It was pathetic. It was all he had. With a desperate cry, he swung the backpack off his shoulders and hurled it with every ounce of his strength. It flew through the air, a ridiculous missile, and smacked the sludge villain squarely in one of its large, bulbous eyes. A notebook spilled out, its pages fluttering in the heat, a desperate prayer offered to the indifferent sky. The villain roared in pain and surprise, its semi-solid form flinching. For a single, glorious second, its grip on Bakugo loosened. Air. Bakugo gasped, taking in a desperate, ragged breath. Their eyes met. Deku? What the hell are you? I couldn't just stand there and watch you die. Izuku screamed, his voice cracking with terror and adrenaline. He was clawing at the sludge now, his fingers sinking into the thick, foul-smelling substance. It was like trying to dig through tar. It was useless, but he couldn't stop. You looked like you were asking for help. That single, honest admission seemed to break something in Bakugo. For a moment, the fury in his eyes was replaced by something else. Shock. Confusion. The moment was shattered as the villain recovered. A massive tendril of sludge swatted Izuku away like a fly, sending him tumbling across the asphalt. His head cracked against the ground, and the world swam in a haze of pain. You little gnat! The villain howled, its attention now fully on Izuku. I'll kill you first! Izuku looked up, his body refusing to move, and saw a green fist the size of a car descending upon him. This was it. This was how it ended. A pathetic, useless death in a dirty alleyway. I'm sorry, Mom. Suddenly, a massive shape blocked his vision. I really am pathetic, a booming voice declared. Izuku blinked, his vision clearing. It was All Might, standing between him and the villain, his body bulked back up to its heroic form, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. All Might, Izuku whispered. I stand here and lecture you on what makes a hero. All Might said, his voice a low growl of self-recrimination as he effortlessly held back the villain's attack. But you, young man, you reminded me what's truly important. He gripped Bakugo's arm, his fingers digging into flesh beneath the slime. A hero always risks their life to do what's right. With a final, deafening roar, he pulled his arm back. Detroit. Smash! The punch was a force of nature. The air pressure alone was a physical blow, a concussive wave that tore the sludge villain to pieces, scattering it like green rain. The shockwave changed the weather, clouds swirling in the sky above them as a sudden downpour began, extinguishing the fires in an instant. Silence. Then, cheers erupted from the crowd. All Might stood tall, one fist raised in triumph, his signature smile firmly in place. The aftermath was a whirlwind of activity. The scattered sludge was collected. Bakugo was checked over by paramedics, coughing and gasping but otherwise unharmed. He was praised for his powerful quirk, for his endurance. Izuku, on the other hand, was scolded. That was incredibly reckless, son. Death Arms said, his voice stern. You could have been killed. You interfered with our work and put yourself and the hostage in even more danger. Kamui Woods nodded, his wooden features grim. There's a reason we have licenses. Leave the hero work to the professionals. Every word was a twisting knife in the wound All Might had already inflicted. He stood there, head bowed, drenched in rain and shame, mumbling apologies. He caught a glimpse of Bakugo being led away. Their eyes met again. There was no gratitude in Bakugo's gaze. Only a burning, humiliated fury. This was his life. The world would praise the powerful for simply surviving, while it would condemn the powerless for trying to help. All Might's words echoed in his head again. You have to be realistic. He was. He saw the reality now. It was harsh and unyielding. He didn't belong here. He turned to leave, to disappear back into the anonymous, quirkless life that awaited him, when the world changed. It began with a sound. It was not a sound that entered through the ears, but one that resonated directly in the bones, in the teeth. It was the chime of a billion crystal bells and the roar of a dying star all at once. The rain, which had been falling steadily, suddenly halted, every drop hanging suspended in midair like a jewel. The frantic shouts of the heroes, the clicking of cameras, the wail of distant sirens, it all faded into an impossible, profound silence. Time itself seemed to have frozen. Death Arms was mid-gesture, his mouth open to deliver another line of his lecture. A news reporter stood frozen, microphone halfway to her lips. Bakugo, a few yards away, was a statue of indignant rage. Only Izuku could move. He stood, trembling, in a world of living statues. Then, the light came. It wasn't like a quirk. It wasn't sunlight. It was a column of pure, concentrated rainbow that slammed into the asphalt 10 feet in front of him with a sound like shattering continents. It wasn't hot, but it radiated an energy that made the hairs on his arms stand up, a power so ancient and vast it felt like staring into the face of creation itself. The air warped around it, and the very ground beneath his feet hummed with its impossible presence. Izuku stumbled back, his heart trying to hammer its way out of his ribcage. He shielded his eyes as the light intensified, and from its core, a figure began to resolve. He was tall, broader than any man Izuku had ever seen, clad in impossibly ornate golden armor that seemed to be forged from captured starlight. A horned helmet sat upon his head, and in his hands he held a massive sword that glowed with a soft, internal luminescence. But it was his eyes that held Izuku captive. They were the color of molten gold, and they didn't just look at him, they looked through him. They saw his broken dream, his flickering hope, his boundless, aching desire to help. They saw everything. The figure took a step forward, his armored boots making no sound on the scorched pavement where the light had struck. The pillar of rainbow energy receded, collapsing in on itself and vanishing as if it had never been, leaving behind a perfectly etched, circular pattern of complex runes burned into the ground. The armored giant stood before him, a god in a dirty back alley. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and clear, a deep baritone that carried an absolute authority that dwarfed even All Might's. Izuku Midoriya of Midgard. Izuku flinched. How did this being know his name? What was a Midgard? The golden-eyed man continued, his gaze unwavering. I am Heimdall, guardian of the Bifrost. The name meant nothing to Izuku, but the title sent a shiver of profound, cosmological dread down his spine. You have been observed, Heimdall stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact. Your actions this day, your selfless charge against an insurmountable foe, performed with no power of your own, born of naught but the will to protect another, this act has shone like a beacon across the realms. Izuku could only stare, his mind a complete blank. This had to be a dream. Or a quirk. Someone's powerful illusion quirk. The All-Father, Odin Borson, King of Asgard, has witnessed your spirit, Heimdall declared, his voice rising slightly, taking on a tone of royal proclamation. He gestured with one gauntlet hand, not at Izuku, but at the sky above. And he summons you. The words hung in the silent air, incomprehensible. All-Father? Odin? Asgard? These were names from ancient, forgotten myths. Norse mythology. I don't understand. Izuku stammered, his voice barely a squeak. Heimdall's expression did not change, but his golden eyes seemed to soften with a sliver of understanding. You are not expected to, but your path does not lie here, in the dirt of this world that scorns your heart. Your destiny awaits you in Asgard. He turned and began to walk back towards the scorched circle on the ground. He paused, looking back at Izuku. Come! The All-Father does not like to be kept waiting, fear warred with a desperate, burgeoning flicker of something Izuku hadn't felt since he stood on that rooftop. Hope. This was insane. It was impossible. But it was happening. The world around him was literally frozen in time. A mythical being was offering him, what? An escape? A purpose? He looked at the frozen figures of the heroes who had just berated him. He looked at the unmoving form of Kaken, his face a mask of anger. This was his reality. A world where he would always be Deku, the useless, quirkless boy who got in the way. Then he looked back at Heimdall, a figure of impossible majesty, who spoke of destiny and kings in a place called Asgard. His feet, for the second time that day, made the decision for him. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. He walked past the statue of Death Arms, past the frozen raindrops, and stopped beside the golden-armored guardian. What will happen? He asked, his voice trembling. You will be given a choice, Heimdall said simply. He raised his great sword and pointed its tip at the center of the runic circle. And a chance to become what you were always meant to be. Light erupted from the tip of the sword. The Bifrost bloomed once more, a swirling vortex of color and cosmic energy. It did not feel menacing this time, but inviting. Heimdall placed a heavy, reassuring hand on Izuku's shoulder. Do not be afraid, champion. Champion. The word settled in Izuku's soul, a balm on the wound that had been torn open just an hour ago. He took a deep breath, the strange, ozone-scented air of the Bifrost filling his lungs, and stepped into the light. The sensation was indescribable. It was the feeling of being torn into a million component atoms and flung across the universe at impossible speeds, all while being held together by an ancient, unbreakable will. Colors he had no name for streamed past his vision. He heard the music of distant nebulae and the whispers of dying galaxies. He saw the great, glowing branches of Yggdrasil itself, a roadmap of reality. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The light faded, and Izuku Midoriya, the quirkless, crying boy from Mizutsu, stood on solid ground once more, blinking in the golden light of a new world. Behind him, on Earth, time resumed its flow. The raindrops fell. The heroes unfroze, blinking in confusion. Hey, where did that kid go? Death Arms asked, looking around. In the middle of the alley, a strange, intricate circle was burned into the pavement, already steaming in the rain. It was the only evidence that Izuku Midoriya had ever been there at all. The transition was less a journey and more a fundamental reordering of existence. One moment, Izuku was in a dirty alley in Mizutsu. The next he was a stream of disembodied consciousness hurtling through a kaleidoscope of creation. He felt the chill of voids between stars, the warmth of nascent suns, and heard a symphony of cosmic radiation. Then, with a sensation like a bell ringing through every cell in his body. He was whole again. He stumbled forward, his worn red sneakers scuffing against a floor of polished, luminous gold. He gasped, his lungs suddenly working again, and the air he drew in was different. It was crisp, clean, and carried a faint, metallic tang, like the air after a lightning strike. He was standing in a vast, circular chamber. The walls were a marvel of intricate, moving metal, golden and bronze rings that spun in slow, silent orbits around a central sphere that pulsed with the light of a captured star. The entire room hummed with a low, resonant power that made his teeth ache. He looked up and saw not a ceiling, but the stardusted velvet of space itself, nebulae and galaxies drifting in a slow, celestial ballet. "This is Himinjorg, the Sky Mountain," a deep voice rumbled beside him. "My watch post at the end of Bifrost." Izuku turned to see Heimdall. The golden-armored giant was sliding his massive, glowing sword into a pedestal at the center of the room. As the blade settled into place, the miniature star in the chamber pulsed once, and the great rings on the walls shifted their alignment with a soft, grinding chime. The sight was so impossibly advanced, so far beyond any technology Izuku had ever conceived of, that his analytical mind short-circuited. It wasn't science, it was magic made manifest as machinery. "The Bifrost?" Izuku managed, his voice a reedy whisper. "The rainbow bridge you traveled upon," Heimdall explained, his golden eyes fixed on Izuku. "The link between Asgard and the other 8 realms. A link which I alone guard." Heimdall gestured towards the grand archway that served as the chamber's only exit. "Come. The Allfather is waiting." Izuku, still numb with shock, could only nod and follow. He stepped out of the observatory, and his world tilted on its axis. Before him stretched a bridge. It wasn't made of steel or stone, but of solid, shimmering, multicolored light, a captured rainbow given form and substance. It soared across an endless, star-flecked void, connecting the golden observatory to a distant, gleaming city that defied all laws of physics and architecture, Asgard. It rose from the clouds like a dream of a god. Spires of pure gold pierced the heavens, so tall their peaks were lost in the ethereal glow of the realm's sky. Waterfalls cascaded from floating, verdant islands, their spray catching the light and creating 1,000 miniature rainbows that danced in the air. Graceful, swan-prowed ships, their sails woven from light, drifted silently between the towers. The entire city pulsed with a gentle, golden luminescence, a beacon of impossible beauty in the heart of the cosmos. Izuku's knees felt weak. He had seen incredible things in his life, heroes who could control fire, ice, even gravity. But this was the universe revealing its true, breathtaking scale. He was an ant who had just been shown a mountain range. "It is real," he breathed, the words stolen from him by the sheer, overwhelming majesty of the sight. "As real as the ground beneath your feet," Heimdall said, his voice not unkindly. He began to walk, his armored boots making a solid, rhythmic clang on the crystalline surface of the bridge. Izuku hurried to keep up, his eyes darting everywhere at once, trying to absorb everything. He felt a profound, aching smallness, a sense of being utterly out of his depth. What could a place like this possibly want with a quirkless, useless boy from Japan? As they neared the city proper, the sheer scale of it became even more apparent. A colossal archway, wrought in gold and silver and guarded by 2 towering statues of ancient, bearded warriors, marked the entrance. Asgardians, clad in fine leathers, shimmering silks, and gleaming armor, walked the wide boulevards. They were all tall, beautiful, and radiated a confidence that made Izuku want to shrink into himself. He saw warriors laughing as they sharpened their blades, merchants displaying glowing fruits and shimmering textiles, and children chasing small, winged creatures through the air. It was a living, breathing city, vibrant and ancient. Whispers followed them. The sight of Heimdall, the ever-vigilant guardian, walking away from his post was an event in itself. But it was his companion that drew their stares. Izuku, in his black school uniform and scuffed red shoes, was a smudge of mundane gray in a world of impossible color. He was small, scrawny, and so obviously out of place that the Asgardians looked at him with open, unabashed curiosity. He could feel their eyes on him, hear the murmur of a language that sounded like crackling flames and flowing water, and he hunched his shoulders, pulling his worn backpack straps tighter. a useless gesture of self-preservation. Heimdall led him through winding streets and across grand plazas, each more magnificent than the last. Finally, they arrived before the largest structure in the city, a palace of such grandeur it made the rest of Asgard look like a humble village. It was here that Heimdall stopped. "My duty requires me to return to my posts," the guardian said. Two imposing guards, their helmets shaped like the heads of eagles and their spears crackling with latent energy, stepped forward. "The Einherjar will escort you from here." Izuku swallowed hard, watching the towering guardian turn and stride back towards the Bifrost. He was alone, truly alone, in a world beyond his wildest comprehension. The two guards flanked him, their faces impassive and unreadable. One of them gestured with his spear down a vast, echoing hallway. Izuku got the message and began to walk, his footsteps a pathetic little shuffle compared to the guard's heavy, synchronized tread. The interior of the palace was even more opulent than the city outside. The ceilings were so high they seemed to have their own weather systems. Massive tapestries adorned the walls, depicting epic battles between gods and monsters, the weaving so fine they looked like photographs of historical events. They passed through halls lined with statues of heroes and kings, their marble eyes seeming to follow his progress with silent judgment. Finally, they reached a set of colossal golden doors, easily 50 feet high, carved with the image of a great, sprawling tree whose roots and branches seemed to encompass the universe. The Einherjar guards slammed the butts of their spears onto the marble floor, and the sound echoed like a thunderclap. Slowly, with a groan that seemed to shake the very foundations of the palace, the great doors swung inward, revealing the throne room. Izuku's breath caught in his throat. The room was a vast cavern of gold and marble. A single, wide carpet of deep crimson ran the length of the hall, leading to a raised dais at the far end. 6 massive pillars, carved into the likenesses of ancient kings, held up the vaulted ceiling, where a fresco of the 9 realms glittered with inlaid stars. Braziers burned with a clean, white fire that cast no smoke, filling the air with a warm, golden light. But all of that was just the frame. The picture, the centerpiece of it all, was the throne. And the man who sat upon it. He was old, his long beard as white as the snows of Jotunheim. A polished gold eye patch covered his right eye, but his left eye burned with a sharp, piercing intelligence that saw everything and missed nothing. He wore ornate golden armor, a deep blue cape draped over his shoulders. In his right hand, he held a magnificent spear, its tip glowing with a faint, dangerous light. He radiated power, not in the explosive, boisterous way of All Might, but in a quiet, absolute way. It was the power of a mountain, of a deep ocean, of a king who had ruled for eons and had seen the birth and death of stars. 2 large ravens, their feathers the color of polished obsidian, sat on the back of his throne, their beady eyes fixed on Izuku. This was Odin. To his right stood a woman of breathtaking grace. She wore a gown of starlight and silver, her long, braided hair the color of spun gold. Her face was kind, etched with the wisdom of ages, and her smile was a small, reassuring beacon in the intimidating vastness of the hall. This had to be the Queen, Frigga. To the left of the throne stood a colossus of a man. He was even taller than the Einherjar, his physique a testament to a lifetime of battle. Long, blonde hair fell over the shoulders of his silver armor and crimson cape. His face was handsome, framed by a short beard, and his blue eyes sparkled with a mixture of amusement and open skepticism as he looked Izuku up and down. A powerful, square-headed hammer hung from his belt, radiating an energy almost as potent as the king's spear. This was Thor, the god of thunder, Izuku's hero analysis mind supplied, dredging up half-remembered myths. He looked exactly like the legends, only more real, more powerful, and currently, he looked like he was trying very hard not to laugh. And then there was one more. Leaning against one of the great pillars, slightly apart from the royal family, was a 4th figure. He was slender and pale, with sharp, intelligent features and slicked-back raven hair. He was clad in green and black leather, with subtle gold accents. While Thor's power was a roaring bonfire, this man's was a coiled serpent, hidden and waiting. He wasn't looking at Izuku with amusement, but with a keen, analytical curiosity. A faint, knowing smirk played on his lips, as if he were the only one in the room who understood a particularly clever joke. This was Loki. Izuku's walk down the crimson carpet was the longest of his life. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of his own frantic heartbeat and the soft scuff of his sneakers. He felt like an insect crawling before giants. When he finally reached the foot of the dais, he didn't know what to do. Bow? Kneel? He settled for standing stock still, trembling, his eyes fixed on the marble floor. Izuku Midoriya. The voice filled the hall, seeming to come from all directions at once. It was Odin's. It was ancient, powerful, and carried the weight of command that could silence armies. Izuku flinched, instinctively bowing his head lower. You have traveled far. Lift your head. Let me see the boy who charged a monster with nothing but a school bag and a desperate heart. Slowly, hesitantly, Izuku raised his head. He met the All-Father's single eye, and felt as if his entire life, every hope and every failure, was being laid bare for inspection. I don't know why I'm here, Izuku stammered, his voice barely audible in the cavernous hall. Odin's expression remained stern, but a flicker of something, not quite sympathy, but understanding, passed through his eye. You are here because I brought you here. I sit upon Hlisjulf and I see all that transpires across the 9 realms. I see acts of great valor and of great cowardice. I see kings rise and empires fall, but rarely do I see what I saw in you today. He leaned forward slightly, the wood of his throne groaning under the shift in weight. The realms are rife with power. My son, he gestured to Thor, who straightened up, puffing out his chest, possesses strength enough to shatter mountains. The people of your world are blessed with abilities you call quirks. Power is common. It is a tool, a weapon, a birthright. But it can also be a poison. It breeds arrogance. It fosters a belief that might alone makes right. Odin's gaze flickered to Thor, and for a moment, the thunder god's proud smile faltered. The jab was subtle, but it had landed. You, boy, Odin continued, his eye returning to Izuku, possess no such power. You have lived a life defined by its absence. You have been told you are less. You have been told you are worthless. You have been told to abandon your dream. Each word was a painful truth that lanced through Izuku's heart. He felt tears welling in his eyes. And yet, Odin's voice softened, but lost none of its power. When you saw another in peril, when you saw those with power stand idle, you, the powerless one, were the first to act. You did not act with the expectation of victory. You acted because your spirit would allow you to do nothing else. That, Izuku Midoriya, is not a weakness. It is the purest form of strength I have seen in millennia. It is the heart of a true hero. A quality that cannot be granted or inherited, only forged in the crucible of a selfless soul. The Allfather rose from his throne. The air in the room grew thick with power, a palpable pressure that made Izuku's ears pop. I have grown weary of champions who believe their power makes them worthy. I seek a champion who is worthy of being given power. I offer you a purpose, child of Midgard. A chance to fulfill the dream your world denied you, not as a hero for one city, but as a champion for all the 9 realms, under my banner. I offer you the power to protect. Izuku stared, his mind reeling. Champion of the 9 realms? Him? Deku? The sheer absurdity of it was overwhelming, but the words, the power to protect, they were the song his soul had been singing his entire life. Why me? He whispered, the question torn from the deepest part of his insecurity. It was Queen Frigga who answered, her voice a gentle melody that cut through Odin's thundering pronouncements. Because, my dear child, a sword is only as noble as the hand that wields it. A heart like yours is a rarer treasure than all the gold in Asgard. She gave him a warm, motherly smile that reached her eyes, and for the first time since arriving, Izuku felt a sliver of the terror in his chest recede. Odin raised his spear, Gungnir, and tapped its butt on the floor of the dais. Bring them. From a corridor beside the throne, 2 Einherjar guards emerged, carrying a pedestal draped in black velvet. They set it down before Izuku and stepped back. With a flick of his wrist, Odin sent a whisper of wind to lift the cloth. Izuku gasped. On the pedestal lay a suit of armor and a pair of gauntlets. They were unlike anything he had ever seen. The armor wasn't bulky plate mail, but a sleek, form-fitting suit of what looked like interlocking scales. The color was a deep, forest green, almost black in the shadows, and it was trimmed with intricate, swirling patterns of Asgardian gold. A breastplate bore the symbol of Yggdrasil, the world tree, its branches and roots glowing with a soft, internal light. The gauntlets were even more remarkable. They were fashioned from the same dark metal, but the back of each hand was set with a brilliant green gemstone that seemed to drink in the light of the room. Golden runes were etched along the length of the forearms, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic energy. Forged by the dwarves of Nidavellir in the heart of a dying star, Odin announced. Quenched in the sacred waters of the Well of Urd. This is the Aegis of Valor. He gestured to the armor. It will grant you durability beyond any mortal man, turning aside blades and blasts that would fell a lesser warrior. His gaze then moved to the gauntlets. And these are the gauntlets of will. They are your true weapon. They are empty vessels, waiting for a power source. And that source is you. Odin stepped down from the dais, his presence immense. He stood before Izuku, a god before a trembling boy. I shall grant you a sliver of my own power. A fraction of the Odin force. But it will not be a power you command with mere thought. The gauntlets will be tied to your spirit, to the very quality that brought you here. The more you desire to protect, the more you yearn to save others from harm, the stronger your power will become. Your will to be a hero is your power. Izuku stared at the armor, his mind unable to process the magnitude of what was happening. A power fueled by his own heroic spirit? It was everything he had ever dreamed of, a perfect, impossible quirk tailored to the very essence of his being. Step forward, Odin commanded. Izuku did, his legs moving on autopilot. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the breastplate. The metal was cool and smooth, but it hummed with a life of its own. As his fingers made contact, the armor seemed to awaken. It dissolved into 1,000 points of green and gold light, which swirled around him like a whirlwind of fireflies. The light enveloped him, and he felt the armor reforming around his body, fitting itself to his slight frame as if it had been made for him. It was weightless, yet he felt profoundly, unbelievably safe within it. The Aegis of Valor settled into place, a second skin of cosmic strength. Then he looked at the gauntlets. He slipped his hands into them. The moment the cool metal touched his skin, the green gems on the back of his hands flared with a brilliant emerald light. Odin placed a heavy hand on Izuku's head. Now receive my gift, power. It was not a painful jolt, but a flood. It felt like the sun was being poured into his veins. A torrent of ancient, cosmic energy washed through him, guided by Odin's will, flowing not into his body, but into the armor and gauntlets he wore. He felt the runes on his arms burn with a pleasant warmth as they absorbed the energy, the green gems glowing so brightly he had to shut his eyes. He felt stronger, more alive, more connected to the universe than ever before. He was no longer just Izuku Midoriya. He was an anchor point for a power beyond mortal understanding. He was no longer quirkless. The light faded. Odin removed his hand. Izuku opened his eyes and looked at his hands. The gauntlets hummed, the gems now pulsing with a steady, heartbeat-like rhythm. He could feel the power resting within them, a dormant wellspring of energy waiting for his call. Try it, Odin urged, his voice a low rumble. Focus not on attacking. Focus on what brought you here. The desire to shield another from harm. Izuku looked up at the All-Father, then at Queen Frigga's encouraging smile. He saw Thor watching with a newfound, genuine curiosity, his earlier amusement gone. He saw Loki, whose smirk had been replaced by an unreadable, calculating expression. He took a shaky breath and did as he was told. He thought of his mother, and how he always wanted to make her feel safe. He thought of Kakin, trapped in the sludge, and the overwhelming, desperate need he'd felt to protect him, even from himself. He focused all that feeling, all that raw, desperate desire to shield and to save, and pushed it towards his right hand. The green gem on the gauntlet flared. A hexagonal pattern of brilliant green light materialized in the air before his palm. It started as a faint shimmer, then solidified into a small, semi-transparent shield of pure energy, about the size of a dinner plate. It wavered, flickering at the edges, a clumsy and pathetic first attempt. But it was real. A choked sob escaped Izuku's lips. He had a power. He had made something from nothing but his own will. Tears streamed down his face, not of sadness or fear, but of an overwhelming, soul-shattering joy that he had waited 14 years to feel. Odin watched the boy cry, and a rare, genuine smile touched his lips. He had made the right choice. He placed a hand on Izuku's armored shoulder, the gesture both a comfort and a coronation. "Arise, Izuku Midoriya," the All-Father's voice boomed through the hall, now filled with a fatherly pride. The Einherjar's heart. Champion of Asgard. The joy of receiving his power was a supernova, a brilliant, all-consuming explosion of light and validation that had left Izuku trembling in its wake. For one glorious, tear-filled moment in the throne room, he had felt whole. He had felt worthy. He had a purpose, a path, a power that was intrinsically, uniquely his. The supernova, however, eventually faded, leaving behind the cold, hard reality of interstellar space. And in that space, Izuku Midoriya was a very small, very fragile planetoid, suddenly caught in the orbit of giants. The reality check came the very next morning. He was awakened in his new quarters. A lavish room with ceilings high enough to accommodate a giraffe and a balcony that overlooked the entirety of Asgard's golden sprawl, by an Einherjar guard whose knock sounded like he was attempting to demolish the door. He was instructed to don his armor and report to the royal training grounds. The training grounds were a vast, circular arena, open to the ethereal Asgardian sky. The floor was a patchwork of packed earth, smooth stone, and shifting metal plates that could be reconfigured for different combat scenarios. Racks of weapons lined the perimeter, holding swords, spears, axes, and maces of every conceivable size and design, each one a masterwork that would be a king's ransom on Midgard. Waiting for him in the center of the arena were 4 figures. 3 of them stood together, a formidable trio of Asgard's finest. There was the warrior maiden, Lady Sif, her dark hair tied back severely, her double-bladed sword resting on her shoulder. Her expression was stern, her dark eyes assessing him with a professional, critical gaze that made Izuku feel like a flawed schematic. Beside her stood the warriors 3. Fandral the dashing, all cavalier charm and a confident smirk, leaned casually on his rapier. Volstagg the voluminous, a mountain of a man with a fiery red beard, gave him a booming, friendly laugh that was somehow still intimidating. And Hogun the grim, silent and severe, his eyes missing nothing, held his mace with a stillness that promised brutal efficiency. These were the heroes of Asgard, legends who had fought alongside Thor in 100 battles across the 9 realms. And they were to be his instructors. The 4th figure stood apart, observing from the edge of the arena. Thor Odinson, Prince of Asgard, leaned against the weapon rack, his arms crossed over his powerful chest. Mjolnir was at his hip. His expression was no longer one of amusement, but of a deep, profound skepticism. Izuku wasn't a joke to him anymore. He was his father's bizarre new project. A stray puppy Odin had decided to declare a wolf. It was, in Thor's eyes, a deeply puzzling, and perhaps even insulting decision. Why look to a frail Midgardian child when Asgard's greatest warrior, himself, was right here? So Sif began, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the morning air. "This is the champion." She circled him slowly, her eyes raking over his form. "He is small. Scrawny. Has he ever held a weapon?" "I no, ma'am," Izuku stammered, his hands fidgeting with the seams of his gauntlets. The aegis of valor, which had felt so empowering in the throne room, now felt like an oversized costume he was playing dress-up in. Fandral chuckled, a light musical sound. "Fear not, little Midgardian. We shall be gentle. The All-Father's favor must be handled with care, after all." The words were pleasant, but the undertone was laced with condescension. Volstagg clapped his huge hands together, the sound like a thunderclap. "Nonsense! The boy needs to be thrown into the thick of it. That's how a warrior is forged. A few bumps and bruises will do him good, builds character." He winked at Izuku, a gesture meant to be reassuring but that only served to heighten Izuku's mounting dread. Hogun said nothing. He simply shifted his grip on his mace, a minute adjustment that spoke volumes. He was not impressed. "Your power," Sif said, stopping directly in front of him, forcing him to meet her intense gaze. "The All-Father tells us it is tied to your will. Show us. Create one of your shields." Izuku's heart hammered against his ribs. It was one thing to manifest a tiny, wavering disk of light under the watchful, encouraging eye of Odin. It was another to perform on command for a gallery of legendary warriors who already thought he was a waste of their time. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic squirrel cage of his thoughts. Protect. Think about protecting. He pictured his mother again, her kind, worried face. He channeled the memory, the love, the fierce, instinctual desire to keep her safe from all harm. He pushed the feeling into his gauntlet. A hexagonal shield of green light flickered into existence before his palm. It was larger than his first attempt, nearly the size of a small buckler, but it was just as unstable. It shimmered and warped at the edges, the light fluctuating in intensity with his own wavering confidence. Sif raised a single, unimpressed eyebrow. She didn't draw her sword. Instead, she took a single step forward and jabbed the shield with 2 fingers. The impact was minimal, no more than a firm poke. But it was enough. The shield shattered into a shower of harmless green sparks, dissolving into nothing. Izuku stared at his empty hand, a hot flush of shame creeping up his neck. Sif grunted. Fragile. She turned to Hogan. Your turn. Do not hold back. Hogan nodded once, his expression unchanging. He hefted his mace, a solid, brutal-looking weapon, and began to advance. Izuku's eyes went wide. He wasn't going to, was he? Wait! Izuku yelped, stumbling backward. I'm not ready for. Hogan didn't slow. He moved with a heavy, inexorable purpose, his steps shaking the very ground. Izuku, panicking, threw up his hands, trying desperately to summon another shield. This time, he thought of All Might, of a symbol of peace standing as an unbreakable barrier against evil. He poured his admiration and desperation into the gauntlets. A much larger shield materialized, a wall of translucent green energy nearly as tall as he was. It was brighter, more solid. For a second, he felt a surge of triumph. Hogan's mace crashed into it. The sound was a deafening crack. The shield held for a fraction of a second, spiderwebbing with fractures of emerald light, before it exploded violently outwards. The feedback threw Izuku off his feet, sending him skidding across the dirt. He landed hard on his back, the wind knocked out of him, his armor taking the brunt of the impact, but his pride utterly shattered. He lay there, gasping for air, staring up at the Asgardian sky as Fandrel's light laughter and Volstag's sympathetic groan echoed around him. Thor, from his position at the edge of the arena, shook his head almost imperceptibly, a silent confirmation of his own doubts. This was the pattern for the next several days. His training was a litany of failures, a master class in humiliation. In sparring, he was hopeless. Fandrel's rapier was a blur, and Izuku would be disarmed and tapped on the chest before he could even process the first move. Volstag's boisterous charges were like being hit by a runaway boulder. Sif's technical mastery was on another plane of existence entirely. She could outmaneuver and pin him in 5 seconds without breaking a sweat. And Hogan? Hogan was a silent, unyielding wall of force that simply overwhelmed him every single time. His power, his supposed gift from the Allfather, was just as useless. It was reactive, emotional, and unreliable. In his desperation to land a blow or defend himself, his mind would race, his focus would fracture, and the energy from his gauntlets would fizzle into nothing or erupt in a useless, uncontrolled flash. He could create concussive blasts, but he couldn't aim them. He could create shields, but they were as brittle as glass. The physical disparity was the worst part. He was a 14-year-old human boy. They were Asgardians, beings with millennia of experience, whose baseline strength and durability were far beyond peak human. Every spar left him aching and bruised, nursing his ego as much as his muscles. He would collapse onto the luxurious bed in his chambers each night, every fiber of his being screaming with exhaustion and the familiar, bitter taste of failure. He was Deku all over again. The useless, powerless Deku. He had been given a god's power, and he was still worthless. The whispers he'd heard in the city streets started to make sense. He was a joke, a mortal pet. Odin's folly. Thor never participated in the training directly, but he was always there, watching. His silent judgment was, in many ways, worse than the other's open condescension. He would watch Izuku get thrown to the ground for the 10th time, a disappointed, almost pained look on his face, before turning and leaving without a word. It felt like he was watching his father's magnificent legacy be tarnished by this weak, sniveling creature from a backwater realm. One evening, after a particularly brutal session where Hogan had disarmed him and sent him tumbling into a weapon rack, Izuku limped back to his room, his spirit at its absolute lowest. He slumped onto his balcony, the cool stone a welcome relief against his aching back, and looked out over the impossible Golden City. It was beautiful. It was a paradise. And he had never felt more alone. The old habits, the ones forged in a crucible of 14 years of inadequacy, began to stir. The feelings were the same: helplessness, frustration, the burning desire to be better. But the context was different. He wasn't just trying to be a hero anymore. He was trying to survive, to prove he wasn't a mistake. His hands, almost of their own volition, went to the small pouch on his belt where he kept his personal effects from Midgard. He pulled out a small, slightly singed notebook and a pen. It wasn't his hero analysis number 13, that was lost to the sludge villain incident, but a new, empty one he'd been given. He stared at the blank page. What was the point? He couldn't analyze beings who were practically gods. Their power wasn't a quirk with rules and drawbacks. It was just power. But then he thought back to the training. He closed his eyes and replayed the humiliating defeats, one by one. But this time, he didn't focus on his own failure. He focused on them. He remembered Fandrel's footwork. He always led with his right foot, a fencer's stance. He favored lunging attacks and relied on his speed to recover if he overextended. His taunts weren't just for show. They were designed to make his opponent angry, to make them sloppy. Weakness, overconfidence. Izuku began to scribble, the pen scratching furiously across the page. Prone to flourishes. Leaves openings after a parry. He pictured Volstagg. The big man was a powerhouse, but he was slow to change direction. His charges were always in a straight line. His wide, sweeping attacks with his axe left his entire left side exposed for a crucial half-second. Analysis. Momentum is key. Use his own force against him. Low agility. Predictable trajectory. He thought of Sif. She was perfect. Almost. Her technique was flawless, a beautiful, deadly dance. But she was a traditionalist. She fought with honor and discipline. She expected her opponent to do the same. She wasn't expecting something else. She wasn't expecting dirty tricks. Note: unconventional tactics might be effective. Relies on established forms. How to be unpredictable. He saved Hogan for last. The grim warrior was the hardest. He was a fortress. Patient, economical in his movements, brutally efficient. He didn't have any obvious weaknesses. He didn't taunt, he didn't flourish. He just won. But as Izuku replayed their spars, he noticed something. Hogan always controlled the center of the arena. He forced his opponents to come to him, to fight on his terms, on his ground. He was a defensive fighter who used overwhelming counteroffensives. Strategy: don't engage directly. Force him to move. Lure him out of his optimal position. Make him the aggressor. The page began to fill up. Diagrams of stances, notes on timing, theories on feints and counters. The familiar, meticulous analysis flowed out of him, a comforting ritual in this strange, overwhelming new world. He wasn't just Deku, the punching bag. He was Izuku Midoriya, the analyst. This was something he was good at. A small, defiant spark of his old self began to glow in the darkness. He didn't stop with the warriors. He thought of Thor. He had only seen him fight in the Midgardian news reports he'd obsessively watched, but he'd seen enough. Thor was a storm. He wielded Mjolnir with devastating power, using it for ranged attacks and brutal close-quarters combat. But he relied on it. He almost always led with a swing of the hammer. What happened if you took the hammer out of the equation? Thor, powerhouse. Heavily reliant on Mjolnir. Strategy: separate from weapon? Exploit recovery time after a large swing or throw. He even dared to think about the others he'd met. Loki. His power was subtle, a whisper in the shadows. He had seen the way Loki watched the training sessions, his eyes missing nothing, a faint smirk on his lips. He wasn't watching the fight. He was watching the fighters. He was analyzing, just like Izuku. But his analysis felt different. Colder. More manipulative. Loki, intelligence-based fighter. Misdirection. Illusion? Psychological warfare. Unknown capabilities. High threat. Do not trust. The moon, or whatever passed for a moon in Asgard's sky, had risen high by the time he finished. His hand ached, but his mind was clear for the first time in days. He had pages of notes, theories, and potential strategies. It wasn't a guarantee of victory, but it was something more important. It was a plan. It was hope. The next morning, he walked onto the training grounds with a different kind of energy. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was accompanied by a quiet, thrumming resolve. Ready for another lesson in humility, Midgardian? Fandral asked with his usual easy grin. I am, Izuku replied, his voice steady. I'll spar with Hogan. The others looked surprised. Even Hogan raised an eyebrow almost imperceptibly. To volunteer to face his most difficult opponent first was either supreme foolishness or a new brand of courage. Hogan nodded and stepped forward, mace held ready. The spar began as it always did. Hogan took his stance in the center of the ring, a granite statue of martial prowess, waiting for Izuku to make the first, doomed move. But Izuku didn't. He didn't charge. He didn't try to summon a clumsy shield. He just stood there, outside of Hogan's effective range, watching him. Waiting. Minutes passed. The silence was thick. Fandral's smirk faded, replaced by confusion. Sif watched with a new intensity, her head cocked to the side. Hogan, realizing Izuku wasn't going to play his game, was forced to act. He took a heavy step forward. Izuku immediately mirrored the movement, circling to the left, maintaining the distance. Hogan stepped again. Izuku matched him again. It became a slow, deliberate dance. Izuku was refusing to engage on Hogan's terms. He was forcing the patient warrior to become the aggressor. A flicker of irritation crossed Hogan's face. He finally broke the pattern, lunging forward with a speed that belied his size, his mace whistling through the air. This was the moment Izuku had been waiting for. He didn't try to block. He didn't try to counter. He dodged. He dove to the side, a clumsy, rolling maneuver that was anything but graceful, but it was effective. Hogan's mace slammed into the ground where Izuku had been standing, cracking the stone. The attack had forced Hogan out of the center of the ring. He had overextended. For a single, fleeting moment, his back was partially turned. Izuku scrambled to his feet. He didn't try for a physical attack. He focused, channeling his will into his gauntlets. He didn't think about a grand, powerful shield. He thought of something small, sharp, and precise. He pictured a push. A shove. A small, concentrated bolt of green energy, no bigger than his fist, shot out from his gauntlet and slammed into the back of Hogan's knee. It wasn't powerful enough to injure him, not even close. But it was unexpected. The impact made Hogan's leg buckle for a split second. It broke his stance. It threw him off balance. He recovered instantly, whirling around with a furious look in his eyes. But Izuku was already moving again, creating distance, his mind already calculating the next step. He had landed a hit. It was a pathetic, dishonorable-looking shot to the back of the leg, but it was a hit. He had used his mind, not his power, to create an opening. The spar continued. Izuku didn't win. He didn't even come close. Hogan, now thoroughly irritated, cornered him and ended the match with a swift, definitive blow that sent him to the dirt once again. But it had taken him 3 times as long as usual. And Izuku had landed 2 more of those small, annoying, tactical energy blasts. When he got to his feet, panting and covered in dust, the atmosphere had changed. Fandral wasn't laughing. Volstagg was looking at him with newfound respect. Sif walked over, her expression thoughtful. You have been studying us. It wasn't a question. Yes, ma'am, Izuku managed between breaths. She nodded slowly. Your strength is not in your arm. It is here. She tapped her own temple. We have been trying to train you like an Asgardian. That was our mistake. We must train you to fight like you. From the edge of the arena, Thor pushed himself off the weapon rack. He had seen the whole thing. He had seen the initial, baffling standoff. He had seen the clumsy dodge. He had seen the small, insignificant blast of energy that had made the unflappable Hogan stumble. And he had seen the understanding dawn on his comrades' faces. The boy wasn't a warrior. He was a strategist, a tactician who had been forced to fight a warrior's fight. The look of skepticism on the Thunder God's face was gone, replaced by something new. Intrigue. But there was someone else watching, someone who had understood what Izuku was doing long before anyone else. From the shadowed archway of the palace entrance, Loki observed the scene, a genuine, delighted smile gracing his features. Thor and the others saw a surprising tactic. Loki saw a kindred spirit, a mind that worked in angles and feints, not in straight lines and brute force. This little Midgardian was far more interesting than he had first appeared. Just then, Queen Frigga entered the training grounds, her presence a calming balm after the intensity of the spar. She had been observing Izuku's struggles from afar, her heart aching for the boy who was trying so hard to fit into a world not made for him. She glided over to Izuku, her kind eyes taking in his dusty armor and determined, exhausted face. "Lady Sif is correct," she said, her voice as gentle as a lullaby. "A warrior's path is not the only one to strength. Your mind is your sharpest weapon, Izuku. But even the sharpest weapon can be made keener." She looked at his gauntlets. "Your power is reactive, tied to your emotions. This makes it wild, unpredictable. But magic, Cedar, as we call it, is about focus. Control. It is the art of imposing your will upon the world through understanding and discipline, not just feeling." Frigga smiled. "I have noticed your keen senses, your analytical mind. These are the very foundations of a sorcerer's perception. Perhaps your training should not only be of the body, but of the mind and spirit as well. If you would have me, I would teach you the basics. Not to cast fireballs or summon storms, but to see. To perceive. To defend your own mind and to understand the flow of energies around you." The offer hung in the air, a lifeline. To learn magic? From the Queen of Asgard herself? It was another impossible dream layered on top of the impossible reality he was already living. Izuku looked at Sif's respectful nod, at Thor's curious gaze, and then back at Frigga's kind, open face. He was still out of his depth. He was still small and weak compared to these gods, but for the first time, he felt he had a path forward that was his own. A path that combined his mind, his heart, and the incredible power he had been given. He bowed his head, a gesture of profound, heartfelt gratitude. "Yes, Your Majesty," he said, his voice filled with a new, unshakable resolve. "I would be honored." The 4 months that followed Izuku's investiture were the most grueling, humbling, and transformative of his life. The initial, painful failures on the training grounds had given way to a new, structured reality. He had found his rhythm, a strange and unique cadence in a world of gods and legends. His days were split into 2 distinct halves, each governed by a different philosophy of power. His mornings belonged to Queen Frigga. Their sessions were not held in the clanging arena, but in the serene quiet of the palace's upper gardens or the ancient, dusty silence of the royal library. Here, he was not a warrior, he was a scholar, a student of the unseen. Frigga was a patient and profoundly wise teacher. She explained that Cedar, the magic of the Asgardians, was not about chanting arcane words and waving one's hands, not at its core. It was about perception. It was the art of feeling the subtle grammar of the universe, the flow of life energy, the echoes of events left behind in a room, the subtle tells of a person's intentions rippling in their aura. "Your power from the Allfather is a roaring flame, Izuku," she told him one morning, as they sat cross-legged on a balcony overlooking a waterfall that fell into the stars. "It responds to the great passions of your heart. Cedar is the art of controlling the embers. It is quiet. It is precise." She taught him to meditate, to silence the constant, anxious chatter of his analytical mind and simply listen. At first, all he perceived was silence. But weeks of practice yielded results. He began to feel the vibrant, green life force flowing through the plants in the garden. He could close his eyes and sense the warmth of a person entering a room before he heard their footsteps. He learned to create a small, shimmering ward of energy around his own mind, a mental shield Frigga insisted was the first and most important defense any practitioner of magic must learn. It was frustrating, mentally taxing work, but it was a discipline that resonated with his studious nature. It was like learning a new, infinitely complex form of analysis, one that dealt not in data and observation, but in feeling and intuition. His afternoons were a stark contrast, spent on the training grounds with Sif and the Warriors 3. Their approach to his training had shifted dramatically after his small victory against Hogun. They no longer tried to mold him into a miniature Thor. They recognized that his greatest asset was his mind, and they began to train him to leverage it. Sif taught him defense, not with the aim of overpowering an opponent, but of redirecting their momentum. She drilled him endlessly on footwork, parries, and dodges, teaching him how to use his small size and low center of gravity to his advantage. Volstagg, surprisingly, became his tutor in endurance, showing him how to brace for impacts and manage his stamina in a prolonged engagement. Fandral, his condescension replaced with a grudging respect, taught him the art of the feint, of misdirection, of forcing an opponent to commit to an attack and then punishing their mistake. Even Hogun contributed, his lessons consisting of long periods of silent observation followed by a single, curt piece of advice that was always brutally effective. Izuku began to merge his two worlds. He would use the heightened senses from his cedar training to anticipate a sparring partner's move a split second before it began. He would use his analytical mind to identify a weakness, and then use a small, precise blast from his gauntlets of will to exploit it. He was still no match for any of them in a straight fight, not even close. But he was no longer a helpless punching bag. He was becoming a problem. A tricky, unpredictable, and deeply annoying opponent to fight. He was in the middle of a sparring session with Sif, having successfully used a burst of energy at her feet to force her into a defensive posture, when the summons came. A horn, deep and resonant, echoed from the direction of the Bifrost. It was not the call to arms, but the sound that announced an urgent message for the throne. Their training was dismissed. Izuku, his armor dusty and his body aching in a satisfying, productive way, followed the others towards the palace. A sense of nervous energy, a change in the very atmosphere of Asgard, was palpable. As they entered the great hall, they saw that the throne was already occupied. Odin sat, his single eye fixed on Heimdall, who stood at the foot of the dais, his golden armor seeming to absorb the light of the room. Thor was already present, his hand resting on Mjolnir's handle, his expression eager and intense. Queen Frigga stood beside her husband, her face a mask of serene concern. The entire outpost, All-Father, Heimdall was saying, his voice a low, grim rumble. The watchtower on the Olivigar border. I have called out to them for a full rotation of the sun, and there is no reply. My sight is shrouded. Something blocks my gaze, something cold and ancient. Izuku's blood ran cold. He had spent his evenings studying in the library, learning about the 9 realms. Vanaheim was the sister realm of Asgard, home of the Vanir gods, a realm of lush forests, untamed wilds, and deep, ancient magic. It was a place of life and vitality, a staunch ally to Asgard. For an entire border outpost to go silent was deeply unsettling. The Vanir have reported no incursions? Odin asked, his voice a low thunder. None, Heimdall confirmed. They are as bewildered as we. They are preparing their own scouting parties, but they are a people of peace and nature, not of war. They requested our counsel. Thor stepped forward, his voice booming in the vast hall. Counsel? Father, this is no time for words. A shadow has fallen upon our allies. Let me take the Einherjar. We will march to this outpost, and whatever filth has taken root there will be scoured clean by lightning and steel. Odin held up a hand, silencing his son's bombastic declaration. Patience, Thor. You leap to conclusions of war when we do not yet know if there is an enemy. This could be a natural phenomenon, a magical blight. To arrive with an army at your back would be an act of aggression against our allies, not of aid. This requires subtlety. The All-Father's gaze swept across the hall. It passed over Sif and the Warriors 3, over Thor, and then it settled, with unnerving weight, directly on Izuku. Izuku froze, feeling like a field mouse pinned by the gaze of an eagle. This will be a reconnaissance mission, Odin declared. A small party, to assess the situation and report back. Thor, you will lead. Your strength may be needed. Thor beamed, his pride restored. Of course, father. I will not fail you. However, Odin continued, his eyes still fixed on Izuku. You will not go alone. You will take your brother Loki. His silver tongue and knowledge of the arcane arts may prove useful. Then, the final, world-altering statement. And you will take our new champion. The silence in the hall was thick enough to choke on. Izuku's heart felt like it had stopped. Him? On a real mission? A mission into a silent, unknown danger? Thor's face fell, his triumphant expression curdling into one of disbelief, and then poorly veiled annoyance. Father, the boy. With all respect, this is a delicate situation in an unfamiliar realm. He is still in training. He would be a liability. He is not a child to be coddled in the training yards for a century, Thor, Odin countered, his tone leaving no room for argument. A sword is useless if it is never drawn from its sheath. He has learned much, but he will learn more from one day in the field than a year of sparring with Sif. His unique perspective may be precisely what is needed. This is a test for him, and, he added, his gaze flicking meaningfully to his elder son, a test of your leadership. My word is final. Thor clenched his jaw, but he knew better than to argue further with the Allfather in his court. He bowed his head stiffly. As you command, father. He cast a sideways glance at Izuku, a look that was a potent mixture of irritation and resignation. It was the look of a star athlete being told he had to carry the water boy's equipment. Just as the command was given, a figure seemed to melt out of the shadows near one of the great pillars. Loki, who had been observing the entire proceeding in utter silence, stepped forward with a fluid, predatory grace. An excellent decision, father, he said, his voice a smooth, silken purr that contrasted sharply with Thor's booming tones. He inclined his head, a gesture of respect that somehow felt mocking. My brother's heart is valiant, but his methods can be direct. A mission requiring subtlety would surely benefit from my counsel. He then turned his unnerving green eyes to Izuku, and a slow, conspiratorial smile spread across his face. And I would be honored to guide the fledgling champion on his first flight. It promises to be a most educational journey. Izuku felt a shiver trace its way down his spine. He didn't know which was more terrifying, Thor's open annoyance or Loki's predatory charm. He was trapped between a thunderstorm and a serpent. It is settled then, Odin declared, rising from his throne. Thor, Loki, and Izuku Midoriya. You will journey to Vanaheim. Travel on the Star Skimmer. Learn what has befallen the outpost at Ilivigar. Do not engage any significant force. Observe, report, and return. Go now. Make your preparations. An hour later, Izuku stood on a docking platform high on the side of the palace, staring at the vessel that would carry them. The Star Skimmer was a beautiful, impossible craft. It was long and slender, shaped like a dragonfly, its hull fashioned from a gleaming, bronze-colored wood and its wings like folded panels of captured moonlight. It had no visible engine, no propulsion system he could identify. It simply hummed with a quiet, latent power. Thor was already aboard, barking orders at the two-man crew, his mood still thunderously foul. Loki lounged near the stern, observing the proceedings with an air of detached amusement. Izuku, feeling utterly out of place, clutched the straps of the small pack containing his rations and a medkit, and cautiously boarded. The journey began with a lurch that sent him stumbling. The skiff lifted silently from the platform and shot out over the Golden City, accelerating to an incredible speed. They soared towards the Bifrost, and with a nod from a distant Heimdall, a shimmering gate of rainbow energy opened in their path. They plunged through it. The sensation was a muted version of his first trip to Asgard. The world outside the skiff's crystalline canopy became a blur of cosmic color. But this time, he was not a disembodied consciousness. He was a passenger, and the sight was breathtaking. The tension aboard the small vessel, however, was thick enough to cut with a blade. Thor stood at the prow, his back to them, his crimson cape snapping in the stellar winds. He was the picture of a sulking god. Izuku, meanwhile, tried to make himself as small as possible, sitting on a bench and running a final check on his gauntlets, making sure the gems were pulsing with their steady, rhythmic light. It was Loki who broke the silence. He glided over to Izuku, his movements silent, and sat beside him. Nervous, champion? He asked, his voice low and intimate, as if sharing a secret. A little, Izuku admitted, not looking up from his gauntlets. Okay, a lot. A wise sentiment, Loki purred. Only a fool charges into the unknown without a healthy measure of fear. It is what keeps us sharp. He leaned back, feigning a casual air. Pay my brother no mind. He is uncomplicated. He sees a problem, he hits it with his hammer. He does not understand that some knots are better unpicked than smashed. Izuku risked a glance at Loki. The trickster god was looking at him with an expression of shared understanding, the look of one intellectual to another, stranded amongst barbarians. Your progress on the training grounds has been the talk of the palace, you know, Loki continued, his words like honey. They all expected you to fail. To break. But you did not. You used your mind. You found a different path to strength. I, for one, was not surprised. Brute force is a crude instrument. The sharpest weapon in all the 9 realms, little champion, is a clever mind. It is a weapon my brother has never learned to wield. The flattery was potent, and it landed directly on Izuku's deepest insecurities. To have his intelligence, the only thing he had ever truly been able to rely on, praised by a god, it was seductive. He knew from the mist that Loki was a manipulator, a liar. But his words felt so true, so validating. I'm not that smart, Izuku mumbled, a reflexive habit of self-deprecation. Oh, I disagree, Loki said with a small, sharp smile. You see patterns others miss. Do not ever let anyone, especially my thunderously simple-minded brother, convince you that your caution is a weakness. It is your greatest strength. Their conversation was cut short as the skiff shuddered, emerging from the Bifrost transit stream into the skies of a new realm, Vanaheim. It was a world drenched in green. Where Asgard was gold and marble, Vanaheim was wood and leaf and moss. The forests below were a chaotic, vibrant tapestry of 1,000 different shades of green, stretching to the horizon in every direction. Great, ancient trees, larger than any skyscraper on Earth, formed a dense canopy, their branches interwoven like the fingers of praying hands. The air that filtered into the skiff was thick with the scent of damp earth, strange, sweet blossoms, and life. The outpost is to the north, on the border with the misty plains of Ilivigar, Thor grunted, finally turning around. He pointed. We will land the skiff on that ridge and proceed on foot. The tree cover is too dense to approach directly. As the star skimmer began its descent, Izuku looked down at the endless sea of green below. He remembered Frigga's lessons. Silence your mind. Listen. He closed his eyes, filtering out the hum of the skiff and the rustle of Thor's cape. He tried to feel the life of the world beneath them, the vibrant, thrumming energy he had learned to sense in the Asgardian gardens. He felt it, a powerful, overwhelming wave of green energy. The life force of this realm was ancient, wild, and potent. But as they flew further north, he sensed something else. A patchiness, a discordant note in the world's great symphony. He opened his eyes. Something's wrong, he said quietly. Thor snorted. Of course something is wrong, boy. That is why we are here. No, I mean... Izuku struggled to find the words. Down there. The forest. It feels wrong. It's quiet. It's a forest, Thor said dismissively. Forests are quiet. Not like this, Izuku insisted, his voice gaining a bit of confidence. There's no birdsong. No animal life. It feels numb. Like a dead spot. He was using the senses Frigga had helped him hone, the ability to feel the flow of life energy. Thor, who relied on his eyes and ears, perceived nothing out of the ordinary. Loki, however, leaned forward, his eyes glittering with interest. A dead spot, you say? How fascinating. Describe it. It's like a patch of cold, Izuku tried to explain, looking down. Like the world has a fever, and that part of the forest is a cold sweat. It's centered over there. He pointed to a section of the forest that looked no different from the rest. Thor followed his finger, squinting. I see nothing. And that, dear brother, is precisely the point, Loki said smoothly, standing up. He placed a hand on Izuku's shoulder. Your eyes see the world as it is. The champion's senses perceive the world as it feels. I would trust the latter in a realm as steeped in magic as Vanaheim. His caution is warranted. Thor looked from Loki's smug face to Izuku's earnest, worried one. He was being outmaneuvered, his authority subtly questioned by his trickster brother and a mortal child. He gritted his teeth, his pride stinging. "Fine," he growled, forcing the word out. "We land on the ridge. And we will approach with caution. But the moment we meet a foe, you will both stand behind me." The Starskimmers sat down gently on a rocky outcrop overlooking the canopy. The three of them disembarked, the two-man crew instructed to wait for their signal. The air that met them was cool, unnaturally so for such a vibrant world. And it was utterly, deathly silent. Thor, despite his bluster, was warrior enough to recognize the wrongness of such a silence. He unhooked Mjolnir from his belt, the hammer humming with latent power. Loki drew two wicked-looking daggers from his sleeves, his eyes scanning the shadows. Izuku, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, focused, feeling the power welling in his gauntlets. They followed a barely their trail down from the ridge into the oppressive gloom of the forest. The trees here were ancient, their canopy so thick it blotted out the sky, plunging the forest floor into a perpetual twilight. The ground was covered in a thick carpet of moss that muffled their footsteps, adding to the eerie silence. They walked for nearly an hour, deeper into the dead spot Izuku had sensed. The chill in the air intensified, and they began to see their breath misting before them. It was Izuku who saw it first. Not with his seer, but with his eyes. A strange, silvery sheen on the trunk of a massive tree. He reached out and touched it. Frost. A delicate, intricate pattern of ice crystals, utterly out of place in this lush, green world. It was unnaturally cold to the touch. "Thor," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Thor and Loki came over. The thunder god knelt, scraping at the frost with a gauntlet finger. His face was grim. "Jotunheim," he breathed, the name a curse. "This is the work of a frost giant." "Impossible," Loki mused, though he didn't look surprised. How could they get to Vanaheim without Heimdall seeing them on the Bifrost? There are no secret paths between Jotunheim and this realm. As they contemplated this, Thor's eyes scanned the path ahead. He held up a hand for silence, then pointed. Further up the trail, nestled in the roots of a colossal tree, was the outpost. It was a simple structure of wood and stone, built to blend in with the forest. And it was deathly quiet. A single wisp of smoke, long since gone cold, trailed from its chimney. The gate was ajar. And standing just inside, as if he had been about to step out and greet them, was a Vanir guard. He was frozen solid. His face was a mask of shock and terror, his hand reaching for the hilt of his sword, his entire body encased in a thick, jagged layer of the same unnatural ice. He was a statue of a man's last, horrified moment, a grim, silent testament to the fate of the Alivigar outpost. The whisper of frost had become a scream. And they had just walked right into its heart. The sight of the frozen Vanir guard was a cold fist clenching around Izuku's heart. He had seen death before, in news footage and the distant aftermath of villain attacks. He had felt its imminent, terrifying presence when the sludge villain's fist descended upon him. But this was different. This was not the chaotic byproduct of a fight. This was a deliberate, brutal execution, preserved in ice like a fly in amber. The guard's final, desperate expression was an effigy of terror, a silent scream that echoed in the unnatural stillness of the Vanaheim forest. Thor let out a low, guttural growl, a sound like distant thunder. His grip on Mjolnir tightened, his knuckles white. The air around him crackled with nascent ozone, a physical manifestation of his simmering rage. To find the work of his ancient enemies here, on the soil of their allies, was a profound insult. "Jotuns," he spat, his voice a blade of ice. "Cowards and murderers, skulking in the shadows where they do not belong." Loki, by contrast, displayed no such outrage. His face was a mask of cool, academic curiosity. He circled the frozen guard, his keen eyes taking in every detail. He noted the angle of the ice crystals, the way they radiated outwards from the man's chest, a bloom of lethal cold. He saw the guard's unsheathed sword lying half-buried in the frost at his feet. This was sudden, Loki observed, his voice a soft murmur that was somehow more chilling than Thor's fury. He was taken completely by surprise. They were not expecting an attack. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the silent, moss-covered walls of the outpost. This was not a battle. It was a slaughter. Izuku, meanwhile, was fighting a rising tide of nausea. His mind, The analytical engine he had come to rely on was screaming at him. Analyze the situation. Threat assessment. Environmental factors. But his gut was churning with a primal fear. This was real. This wasn't a sparring match against opponents who would pull their punches. This was a place of death, and the killers were likely still nearby. He forced himself to breathe, to push past the horror and look. He saw what Loki saw, the suddenness of the attack. But his Cedarhorn's senses picked up something else. The dead spot of cold energy he had felt from the sky was a palpable miasma here on the ground. It clung to the air, a spiritual frost that felt oily and wrong. It was centered on the outpost, a pool of lingering malevolence. They're still here, Izuku whispered, his voice trembling slightly. I can feel it. The cold, it's not old. It's fresh. Thor didn't need the warning. He was already moving, his initial rage settling into a grim, focused resolve. We secure the outpost. Find any survivors. Then we find the Jotuns who did this, and I will send them back to their frozen wasteland in pieces. He took a step towards the gate, every line of his body screaming aggression. Brother, wait, Loki cautioned, holding up a hand. Your approach is, as ever, direct. Perhaps we should consider. Consider what, Loki? Thor interrupted, rounding on him. That these monsters should be allowed to desecrate this place a moment longer? We are the sons of Odin. We do not consider when faced with such butchery. We act. Without waiting for a response, Thor strode through the gate and into the small courtyard of the outpost. Izuku and Loki exchanged a look. Loki's was one of weary exasperation, Izuku's of pure terror, and hurried to follow. The courtyard was a scene of frozen carnage. It was as if time had stopped in a single, brutal moment. 2 more Vanir guards lay where they had fallen, their bodies encased in the same jagged ice. One had been in the middle of sharpening his axe, the whetstone still frozen to his hand. The other had been reaching for a drinking horn on a table. The water that had spilled from it was a cascade of suspended, icy droplets. The entire outpost was a tomb, sealed in a layer of the same unnatural frost that coated the trees outside. Thor moved through the scene with a heavy, grim tread, his eyes burning with a righteous fire. He checked the main barracks, the small mess hall, the watchtower. Each room told the same silent, horrific story. No survivors. Just more frozen statues of the dead. They came in the night, Thor growled, his voice echoing in the dead quiet. Silent. Swift. This is not the Jotun's way. They are boisterous savages who delight in the clang of battle. Perhaps they have learned a new tactic, Loki suggested, his eyes darting towards the deep, oppressive shadows of the surrounding forest. Or perhaps these are not typical Jotun warriors. Izuku, following a few steps behind them, felt the cold sensation intensify. It wasn't just a lingering energy anymore. It was active, a malevolent presence that prickled at the edge of his senses. He felt like he was being watched by 1,000 unseen eyes. The simple mental ward Frigga had taught him to maintain felt paper thin, a single sheet of glass against a coming hailstorm. Something's wrong, he said again, his voice tight. This feels like a trap. Thor, his blood up, was in no mood for caution. Of course it's a trap, boy. They left this scene to bait anyone who came to investigate. Well, I am here. And I will not be baited. I will be the one who. He was cut off by a sound. A low, guttural laugh that seemed to come from the trees themselves, a sound like grinding glaciers. It was followed by a sharp, whistling noise. Down! Loki hissed, tackling Izuku and pulling him behind the frozen table. A massive icicle, the size of a spear and unnaturally sharp, slammed into the wooden wall where Izuku's head had been a second before. It hit with enough force to shatter the frozen timbers, embedding itself deep within the structure. Thor roared in fury, whirling around, Mjolnir in hand. Show yourselves, cowards, the forest answered. From the deep shadows under the canopy, figures began to emerge. They were huge, easily 9 to 10 feet tall, their skin the color of blue-gray ice, etched with intricate, dark blue markings. Their eyes glowed with a feral, red light. They were frost giants, the ancient enemies of Asgard. But these were not the heavily armored brutes Izuku had read about. They were clad in dark, supple leathers that blended with the forest shadows, and they carried cruel-looking axes and daggers carved from solid ice. They were not warriors. They were hunters. There were at least a dozen of them, fanning out, their movements silent and coordinated. They were surrounding the small outpost, their red eyes glowing with predatory hunger. "So, the little prince of Asgard takes the bait," the leader sneered. He was larger than the others, his skin a darker shade of blue, a jagged scar running across one glowing red eye. "And he brings with him the serpent, and what is this? A little golden pet?" He gave Izuku a dismissive, contemptuous look. Thor's face was a mask of thunderous fury. "You will pay for what you have done here, Jotun filth, for your crimes against Vanaheim, and the insult to Asgard. I, Thor Odinson, will see you all return to the hell from which you spawned." He didn't wait for a reply. With a battle cry that shook the trees, he began to spin Mjolnir, faster and faster, until it was a silver-gray blur. He launched himself into the air, a living thunderbolt, and flew straight towards the largest group of frost giants. The battle began in a maelstrom of chaos. Thor was a force of nature unleashed. He crashed among the Jotuns like a meteor, Mjolnir singing a song of destruction. He smashed through their ice-forged weapons, sent giants flying with thunderous blows, and called down bolts of lightning that turned the twilight gloom of the forest into a strobe-lit warzone. He was magnificent, a god of war in his element, fighting with the fury of a righteous storm. But the frost giants were not the mindless brutes he had expected. They were clever. They didn't meet his charge head-on. They scattered, using their knowledge of the terrain, melting into the shadows between the massive trees. They let him expend his energy on 2 or 3 of their number, while the others began a coordinated, strategic maneuver. They were using Thor's raw power, his straightforward aggression, as a diversion. Their true targets were the 2 figures still in the courtyard. Loki saw it instantly. "They are trying to separate us," he shouted to Izuku, pulling his daggers. "Predictable. Stay behind me, champion." 2 frost giants, ignoring Thor's rampage, charged the gate. They were fast, their massive legs covering the ground in huge, silent strides. Loki met them, not with force, but with grace. He was a blur of green and black, his daggers weaving a complex pattern in the air. He ducked under a clumsy swing of an ice axe, his own blade lashing out and scoring a deep, steaming gash on the giant's leg. He parried a blow from the second giant, the screech of steel on ice setting Izuku's teeth on edge, and then shimmered, a green, illusory copy of himself appearing to his left. The giant, confused, swung at the illusion, which dissolved into green smoke, leaving its creator free to drive a dagger into its exposed side. Izuku watched, his mind struggling to keep up. This was a real battle. The speed, the brutality, the sheer lethal intent was worlds away from the controlled environment of the training yard. He was frozen, not by the Jotun's ice, but by his own fear. He was useless. He was in the way. He was going to die. "No!" A voice in his head, a voice that sounded remarkably like Frigga's, cut through the panic. "See. Perceive. Don't just look at the battle. Understand it." He forced himself to take a breath, to push down the terror and engage his mind. He looked past the immediate threat of the 2 giants Loki was expertly dispatching. He looked at the bigger picture. Thor was a whirlwind of destruction, but he was being led further and further away from the outpost. The frost giant leader was hanging back, directing his hunters with hand signals, a patient predator watching his trap spring. And more giants were now flanking them, using the trees for cover, preparing to encircle and overwhelm Loki. One particularly large giant, armed with a massive ice club, broke from the tree line. He wasn't aiming for Loki, who was still occupied. He was aiming for the small, green-armored boy who was standing there, doing nothing. He was aiming for the weakest link. Loki saw him out of the corner of his eye. "Izuku!" he yelled, but he couldn't disengage from his own fight in time. The frost giant was a charging mountain of blue muscle. Its red eyes were locked on Izuku, a cruel smile splitting its face. The world seemed to slow down. Izuku saw the individual crystals of ice on the club, saw the condensation of its breath, saw the promise of a swift, crushing death in its eyes. This was it. The moment of truth. All the training, all the theory, all the pain, it all came down to this. He thought of Sif's lessons on footwork. Use your size. Be a target they cannot hit. He didn't run away. He ran towards the giant, a suicidal-looking maneuver. The giant, expecting him to cower or flee, was momentarily surprised by the aggressive move. It swung its massive club in a wide, horizontal arc, an attack meant to pulp him into paste. But Izuku had anticipated it. At the last second, he dropped into a slide, his armored boots skidding on the frosted ground. The club whistled through the air just inches above his head, the wind from its passage tugging at his hair. He slid right between the giant's legs, a ridiculously dangerous, Sif and Fandral-inspired move. He came up behind the giant, scrambling to his feet. He had survived the attack, but now his back was to the monster. He could feel the giant turning, roaring in frustration. He didn't have time to create a shield. He didn't have time to aim a proper blast. He just needed to create an opening. He remembered his spar with Hogan. An unexpected shot. Break their stance. He spun around, thrusting his palm backwards. He didn't aim for a vital spot. He aimed for the ground. He poured a small, concentrated burst of will into his gauntlet, a desperate, panicked pulse of energy. A bolt of green light shot out, and slammed into the icy ground directly under the frost giant's right foot. The effect was not explosive, but it was dramatic. The unnatural ice, already unstable, shattered. The ground beneath it, softened by the moss, gave way. The frost giant, its full weight coming down on that foot as it turned, suddenly found itself on unstable ground. Its ankle twisted with a sickening, audible crunch. The giant bellowed, a sound of pure agony, and its leg gave out. It staggered, its massive body pinwheeling for balance, its club dropping from its hand with a deafening crash. It was the opening Loki needed. With a final, fluid motion, he dispatched the second of his opponents, and vaulted over the table, his daggers a silver flash in the gloom. He was on the crippled giant in an instant, his blades finding their mark in the monster's throat. The giant gurgled, its red eyes wide with surprise, and then crashed to the ground, its lifeblood steaming in the cold air. It dissolved into a shower of frost and ice, returning to its elemental state. Loki landed gracefully beside the dissipating corpse, breathing a little heavily. He looked at Izuku, his green eyes wide with a mixture of shock and genuine surprise. He had fully expected to be saving the boy. He had not expected the boy to save himself, let alone create a perfect tactical opening. He had feigned distress, expecting to use the giant's attack as a way to further manipulate the boy's trust. But Izuku's actions had been real, effective, and entirely his own. That was... Loki began, searching for the right word. Unexpectedly competent. Izuku didn't have time to register the backhanded compliment. His mind was still racing, processing the battlefield. His small victory had bought them a few seconds, but the situation was still dire. Thor! He yelled, his voice finding a strength he didn't know he possessed. He pointed into the forest. It's a trap for you. The leader, on the left flank. He's coordinating them. Thor, having just smashed another Jotun into a shower of ice, heard the boy's cry. His battle haze cleared for a moment. He had been so focused on the enemies in front of him, he hadn't realized he was being systematically herded and isolated. He followed Izuku's pointed finger and saw him, the scarred frost giant leader, directing his hunters from the shadows. With a roar of understanding and renewed fury, Thor changed his tactics. He wasn't just a berserker anymore. He was the god of thunder on a mission. He threw Mjolnir, not at the giants closest to him, but in a wide, curving arc. The hammer, guided by his will, smashed through the trees, ricocheting off trunks with impossible physics, and slammed into two of the flanking giants, taking them out of the fight. It then flew back to his hand, just as he called down a massive fork of lightning that struck the ground right in front of the Jotun leader. The leader leaped back, avoiding the main blast, but the attack had broken his cover and his control over his hunters. The coordinated assault fell apart. The tide had turned. Izuku, his adrenaline still singing, didn't stand idle. He saw another giant trying to circle around to get at Loki's back. He didn't have the power to defeat it, but he could do something else. He could protect. He slammed both of his gauntlet hands together. He didn't think of a small shield or a precise blast. He thought of All Might's unyielding stance, of Odin's immovable presence on his throne, of Frigga's serene, protective aura. He poured every ounce of his will, his fear, and his desperate desire to keep his new comrades safe into his power. "No more!" he screamed, the words torn from his throat. A wall of shimmering, emerald-green energy erupted from his gauntlets. It wasn't the flimsy, wavering shield from the training yard. This one was huge, 10 feet tall and twice as wide, thick and solid, its surface humming with contained power. The charging frost giant, caught by surprise, slammed into it head-on. The impact was like a truck hitting a concrete barrier. The energy shield buckled slightly, a deep boom echoing through the forest, but it held. Cracks of green light spiderwebbed across its surface, but it did not break. The frost giant was thrown backwards, stunned and disoriented. The sight of this tiny mortal creating such a formidable barrier seemed to stun the other Jotuns for a moment, as well. It was an unexpected display of power from the one they had dismissed as a non-threat. That moment of hesitation was all Thor and Loki needed. With the Jotuns' coordination broken and their morale faltering, the two sons of Odin went to work. Thor became a whirlwind of hammer and lightning, a true god of the storm, while Loki moved like a phantom, his daggers finding every opening, his illusions causing chaos and confusion in their ranks. The remaining frost giants, seeing their leader now being forced into a direct confrontation with the furious Thor, broke and fled, melting back into the shadows of the Vanaheim forest. The scarred leader, after a brief, brutal exchange with the god of thunder, saw that the fight was lost. With a final, hateful glare at Thor and a look of pure confusion directed at Izuku, he created a cloud of icy mist and vanished into it. Silence descended once more, broken only by the crackle of residual lightning, the heaving breaths of the three warriors, and the frantic, relieved pounding of Izuku's own heart. The battle was over. The ambush had been repelled. Thor stood in the center of the courtyard, his chest heaving, Mjolnir humming in his hand. He looked at the dissipating remains of the frost giants, then at the massive, still-standing energy shield Izuku had created. It finally flickered and dissolved, leaving Izuku standing there, trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion, his arms aching from the effort. The god of thunder walked over to him. His expression was no longer one of annoyance or skepticism. It was something Izuku had never seen directed at him before from the prince. He looked at the shattered ice where Izuku had made the giant trip. He looked at Loki, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He looked at the spot where the great shield had stood, a shield that had undoubtedly saved Loki from being flanked. He stopped in front of Izuku, a towering figure of myth and legend. Izuku flinched, expecting a rebuke for his reckless charge or his panicked shouting. Instead, Thor reached out and placed a heavy, gauntleted hand on Izuku's shoulder. His grip was firm, solid, and surprisingly gentle. "You fought with the heart of a warrior, Izuku Midoriya," Thor said, his voice a low, sincere rumble. "And the mind of a strategist. You saved my brother's life, and you warned me of the trap I was too blind with rage to see. I was wrong about you." It wasn't a lengthy speech. It wasn't flowery praise. But coming from Thor, the words carried the weight of a king's decree. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance, a grudging but deeply sincere look of respect. Izuku could only stare, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a warmth that spread through his chest. For the first time, he wasn't Odin's champion, or Frigga's student, or a Midgardian stray. He was a comrade. The moment was broken by Loki, who was wiping his daggers clean on a piece of leather. "A touching sentiment, brother. Now, perhaps we should address the more pressing question." He gestured to the silent, frozen outpost, and the dark, listening forest. "How did frost giants get to Vanaheim? And who sent them?"